Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Esquire Coaching Radio Show. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. As you know, Esquire Coaching is a national coaching and consulting firm that is dedicated to empowering lawyers to happily succeed in the business of law. To that end, we discuss the full range of topics, from building business to getting a job to work-life balance and everything in between. Today, we have a very special guest who's come back because we're doing a two-part series on how not to become your own personal injury case. We have Cynthia Lackner, who's going to offer us an overview of how lawyers can self-regulate and self-soothe to help diminish the ongoing effects of secondary PTSD, also known as secondary traumatic stress, or STS. More and more lawyers are triggered by constantly being exposed to extremely disturbing information from their clients. I remember when I was an extern getting some difficult cases with a defense attorney that I was working with, and I could definitely attest to that. And the recounting of these events that are so painful and at times horrific can cause lawyers to feel physically and mentally ill. Cynthia is going to walk us through a better understanding of secondary PTSD. Cynthia has a master's in psychology and is a certified emotional brain training provider. Her emphasis is on helping lawyers learn how to quickly self-regulate their stress response throughout the day. She has a private practice in Denver and also works with people on the phone or through Skype from around the country and worldwide. Cynthia has lectured at the University of Colorado and Denver Law Schools, Lawyers Helping Lawyers Board, Colorado Defense Lawyers Association, the Colorado Trial Lawyers Conference, and its legislative legal services. Learning the self-regulation skills and tools takes approximately 6 one-hour sessions, and doctors are constantly referring lawyers to her. So without any further ado, welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be back this week with you, Anne.
I'm so glad you're here. Last week it was such a riveting discussion. I think something so important for all of our listeners to really take in. And before we dive into the questions, I just want to remind our listeners there will be time at the end of this show to ask any questions you might have directly to Cynthia. You'll have to call 347-838-8719 and press 1 to get in the line. And I'll repeat that number again toward the end. All right, let's dive right in. So, Cynthia, can you talk to us about what exactly is secondary PTSD?
Yes, I can. So here it is. So secondary post-traumatic stress disorder occurs when a person is exposed to extreme events directly experienced by another person and becomes overwhelmed by this secondary exposure to trauma. So in other words, this horrific event that did not happen to you, but you have absorbed it. So far, it is not exactly clear how traumatic stress is transferred from one individual to another. The continuous visualizing of a client's traumatic images added to the effects of burnout can create a condition progressively debilitating called compassion stress or secondary PTSD.
Wow, compassion stress. I've never heard of that. So how does that differ from regular PTSD? What's the difference between secondary and regular?
Okay, so the person that, let's say, we'll just be graphic here, someone that's raped or someone who it was in a domestic abuse issue or and they were actually hurt by it, and they're recounting to an attorney what has happened to them in their life. The attorney gets so distraught listening to the information that they take it on as their own. So in other words, it didn't happen to them, but they get overwhelmed by it. And we'll talk about some of the symptoms that they end up feeling from being triggered themselves from listening to this horrific information.
Oh, I see. So essentially, regular PTSD is for the person who's directly experienced the trauma, if you will, and secondary is for people who are taking this information secondhand, essentially.
That's exactly right. That's right.
Okay, great. So are there any other terms for this particular disorder?
Yeah, so this might be confusing to some people because they're all similar. So secondary trauma stress, so that would be STS, and then vicarious trauma, and then compassion fatigue and compassion stress are all basically the same things, and they're used interchangeably, these terms. So for the purpose of this talk today, I'm going to use the term secondary post-traumatic stress disorder and continually and consistently refer to this disorder as that term, because otherwise I think it would get really confusing for people, and I just think this will be easier for everyone.
I think that's a good call. So, you have a lot of attorneys in your practice. Can you tell us from your experience why you think attorneys in particular are at risk for secondary PTSD?
Absolutely. So as an attorney, depending on the area in which you practice, such as criminal law or personal injury, for example, there is an excellent chance you will come into contact with clients who are and have been traumatized. No one who chooses to work with trauma survivors is immune to the potential deleterious effects of this work. So many clients have some form of PTSD or other serious emotional wounds.
That makes sense, especially like I mentioned in the introduction, defense counsel, I would imagine, or anybody, a prosecutor or someone who's dealing with criminal law in particular. There are some really gory facts and details in there, and I could definitely see that happening in those cases in particular. So what are some of the symptoms that a lawyer might suffer, even if they don't realize that he or she, have this disorder?
Okay, so Anne, that's a great question, and it's actually a long answer, and it's a little bit involved. But let's start with the different symptoms. Okay, so physical symptoms. This would include feeling physically ill, fatigue, anxiety, perhaps lost enjoyment in intimacy. Psychological symptoms would be a person who's feeling more cynical and pessimistic. He or she avoids feelings by maybe even numbing out or shutting down. Possibly work-related nightmares. They have lost interest and enjoyment in activities. They have difficulty in making decisions, and self-esteem can become compromised. Emotional symptoms include anger and depression and feeling of being overwhelmed. Professional symptoms could be unwanted memories appear in your head. Productivity at work has been reduced, and you have thoughts of quitting. Intrusive symptoms, that would be consisting of thoughts and images associated with a client's traumatic experiences. Obsessive-compulsive desire to help certain clients, and client work issues encroach upon personal time. Inability to let go of work-related matters. Perception of survivors as fragile and needing your assistance all the time. Increased perception of demand/threat in both job and environment. Avoidance symptoms would be sense of dread working with certain clients. Loss of sense of competence. Perhaps isolation. There's also a big problem with secretive self-medication, which would be addiction. It could be alcohol, drugs, work, sex, food, spending. And then relational dysfunction would be meaning you're having trouble getting along with certain people. And the last one is arousal symptoms, which would mean increased anxiety, impulsivity, reactivity, increased frustration and anger. There's a huge problem with sleep disturbance, change in weight or appetite, and finally, somatic symptoms. I told you that was a long answer here.
Oh, wow. But honestly, after listening to what you just said, Cynthia, it sounds like almost every lawyer experiences one or more of those symptoms.
Yes,
So
that's
talk to
possible.
us about
Yeah.
treatment. Especially, I'm assuming that when you come across your client base and you're looking at the attorneys that you're serving, would you say that a large or vast majority of the attorneys that you see suffer from some form of secondary PTSD?
Yes, and there's a way to find that out. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people suffer from that, to answer your question. So for me to find out to what level, to what degree, I give them something called Professional Quality of Life Scale. It's called ProQual. And it's actually a compassion, satisfaction, and compassion fatigue scale so that I'm able to assess how involved they are with this, how much this is a problem for them. So that's one of the first things I do. It's a tool I use that helps me quickly identify what the problem is, and then I can help them quickly and efficiently. And then if they're experiencing intense anxiety, which so many attorneys are, that is another primary, secondary PTSD area that I address. And I teach clients a technique that can keep them relaxed. So even when chaos is going on around them, they can keep resilient and less likely to get secondary PTSD. I also teach them the emotional brain training skills and tools that we went over in depth last week, and I finally discussed with them their own personal self-care plan.
So what is this self-care plan that you discuss in particular?
Okay, so first of all, you have a responsibility to yourself as an attorney to be in integrity. And that means not only to be aware of your own belief system, but live within those beliefs every day. So one of the ways of living in integrity is living in balance and out of stress. Because if you're really stressed out, you're not helping your client or yourself. So the other issue is not continuing to ignore how you are feeling throughout the day. And, last week we kept talking about how attorneys are so analytical and they like to think their way out of things. But unfortunately, they're going to have to feel their feelings and figure out how they feel throughout the day. So ways that you can stay in balance and be your best for yourself and others in your professional and personal life is a regular exercise program, in addition to good nutrition, possibly artistic expression, perhaps meditation and mindfulness. Outdoor recreation. Most people feel great if they can, I live in Colorado, so people can ski or even just take a walk. And even perhaps spirituality, whatever that looks like for that person. But incorporating these changes have made profound differences with the clients I've seen. And in addition to addressing those potential symptoms we mentioned earlier, such as physical, psychological, professional, intrusive avoidance, and arousal symptoms, if you deal with that on a regular basis, it will help ensure you that you can stay in balance and out of stress, and you'll be doing yourself and everyone a favor.
Now, I agree with you wholeheartedly. The challenge that I keep hearing, and I'm sure you hear this too, Cynthia, is time. Lawyers are always concerned about, oh my gosh, I can't even make my billable hours or get through my caseload. Right. How am I going to fit in time for exercise or all this self-care or to learn these skills and tools? So in your professional opinion, how much time is actually involved in learning these skills and tools to actively manage secondary PTSD?
Well, I knew you were going to say that, and as I said in my notes here to myself, I can hear you all saying, I don't have time for any of this. But the fact is, you actually don't have time not to do this. Because when we ignore our body's ability to give us clues and warning signs, and we still choose to ignore them, we do that at great risk to our health. So let me give you an example. There's a family law practice here in town, and there were 4 women who are all partners, and out of the 4 partners, the 3 out of 4 have suffered stroke, heart disease, and or cancer. So the situation became extremely serious, and that is when they called me in. But the truth is, I'm all about prevention. I would have much rather worked with each of them before they got into ICU. So that's why I'm saying, yes, I hear about this all the time. Time is a problem, and I work with each client to help them how they can get time in there to address these different issues, address these different ways to help themselves. Because the truth is, if they don't, they're going to focus more on what's bothering them, or they're going to be running to the doctor because they ignored certain signs. Do you see where I'm going with this? They're going to end up having more time on the back end dealing with things that they could have maybe not had to have dealt with in the beginning if they kept everything in balance. And I agree it's a challenge. I'm agreeing with you. It is such a challenge. But I feel like if you don't do it, I've seen what's happened to attorneys. And I talk to young attorneys that say, I don't want to end up like some of the attorneys we know who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s, they can't even practice anymore. They're so ill, and some of them aren't even here anymore, to be honest, because they're gone. And you know what I'm saying.
Mhm. Wow, that's a fantastic reminder. You know, it's so good the way that you phrased it, that it might take a little bit of time now that you have to consciously and deliberately carve out and make time for to take care of yourself. But the amount of time that it would cost you on the back end is significantly more, and it's less enjoyable. You have debilitated health, debilitated well-being, and mental capacity when you've reached the levels that you've just described. So excellent point there, Cynthia. Now, here's the reality. Most lawyers are getting exposed, especially in particular fields of law like criminal law. They're getting exposed to traumatic stories, traumatic pieces of evidence, etc. Why is it that some people are getting secondary PTSD while others are not?
That is a really interesting question. And so in exploring the developmental histories of some of the attorneys with whom I have worked, I found that many carried into their adult lives and careers unresolved attachment and developmental issues. So what happens is when hearing about a traumatic event, they can be triggered by something from their past. So once we address this trigger and get it resolved, we can move forward. The problem with not addressing it and let them go forward as if nothing's happening, the analogy for that, Anne, is what would happen if you never emptied your trash in your house? You just kept throwing trash away, in your trash can, and you just never got rid of it. It would be a problem. This is exactly what happens when you... Right? This is exactly what happens when attorneys keep ignoring some of this emotional trash, if you will, have happened to them, or trauma that they didn't realize was a trauma at different times in their life. By ignoring it, it is not going away. So I can help them identify what that is, and then we can move forward. That's one answer to your question. Another aspect is that, and I think that most attorneys would have to say, yes, I see that. Or they would see it in other attorneys, maybe not themselves, but most attorneys are perfectionists, and they need to learn to relinquish outcomes. So when an attorney does the best he or she can for their client, and they can still lose the case, I know it sounds horrible, but it happens, it can be difficult for some attorneys to not see themselves in a negative light. So then they're full of self-recrimination and even shame. If self-recrimination is significant, the attorney can be triggered that way regarding a traumatic event from their past. So there's a client I work with, and he is an immigration attorney. And he told me when I first started working with him that his migraines are horrific, and he also has severe stomach pains. And he recognized that that was a result with working with clients as an immigration attorney, and he actually even had nightmares because he would have nightmares about what could potentially happen if he lost a case. It was so serious, he said, that some of his clients could be sent back to their original country and possibly die. And so I've worked with him to keep him calm and peaceful so that he can keep doing his work. And I've taught him skills and tools, and honestly, regardless of the outcome. But it's been keeping him mentally and physically healthy. And my concern is there's always a concern around downward spiral if the trauma is ignored. So that's why I'm saying I can't make this case strong enough about that.
That's really interesting. I did not realize how much of a strong correlation there was between past traumatic unresolved traumatic experiences in your own life and how that could be triggered in these with your clients, with what's coming up in your client matters. That's really fascinating. Hold on for 1 second, Cynthia, while I open up the phone lines and see if there's anybody that is interested in asking Cynthia a question. So, listeners, if you are interested in asking Cynthia about secondary PTSD, now is the time to call in. Please call 347-838-8719. That's 347-838-8719, and press 1 to get in the line. All right, while we're waiting to see if anybody's calling in, I wanted to just ask you a few more questions.
Okay.
So what are some of the coping skills that lawyers can employ during and following the experience of this vicarious stress?
Okay, so one of the ways a lawyer can be triggered and suffer from secondary PTSD is constantly looking for validation from peers and clients. So when a lawyer is feeling negative and anxious feelings, secondary PTSD can manifest itself and cause increased anxiety and feelings of victimization and a sense of overwhelming powerlessness. And these symptoms begin to permanently dissipate by incorporating the relaxation, meditation skills combined with adequate rest, exercise, and excellent food choices, and as I said, the emotional brain training skills and tools that you and I discussed at length last week. And the other piece to mention is overall, I would have to say to attorneys, try to find your self-worth that is not based on professional achievements. Of course you want to feel so great about your work. That's a given. But you also want to feel wonderful about being a great partner to someone or a great parent. Or maybe you're really good at playing the piano or you're a wonderful friend or you're a great athlete. Or do you know what I'm saying? Like there's so much more. There's a whole world out there. And if it's only about who you are and what you've done that afternoon or that morning, it's going to be, it could be problematic where it would be very difficult for you to feel good about yourself. And remember that your best is always good enough. And this is so hard for my clients to accept. It's counterintuitive to how they believe, but it really is something I work with them on. And my purpose for being on your show today is awareness. And I just want listeners out there to know that I can help you, and you're not alone. And I'm just so grateful to be able to tell you about these different aspects of PTSD.
And we're so grateful to have you here sharing so much wonderful insight into this matter. And the solutions that you're talking about are wonderful. So what can our listeners do to get more help with specific issues regarding their stress levels or working with difficult clients or difficult people at their firm? Do you have any advice or support for them?
Well, first of all, I would ask you if any of this information you are listening to today resonated. And do you have any of these symptoms and issues? And again, this is not an indictment. This is just noticing, not judging. And if you do, just know that there's help. And if so, I can work with you on Skype or FaceTime or on the phone, just like I'm doing now, speaking to Anne, and it's very, very effective. and I can help you learn these skills and tools of emotional brain training, which is what we discussed, as I've said. We mentioned it more last week, a little bit this week we spoke about, and I can help you with diminishing your secondary PTSD, which was our focus today.
Mhm. You know, I have to say, listeners, if you did not get a chance to listen to last week's episode, please come look at our blog, www.esquirecoaching.com, and there's a link there where you can get a copy of the recording from last week's wonderful interview with Cynthia on emotional brain training and how it can be such an effective tool to help you manage your stress levels. Now, you have given us so much wonderful information. I was wondering if you could share with us, just, without any personal details, but a success story, a client that you've worked with, an attorney who was dealing with secondary PTSD and the positive outcome that's resulted after working with you.
Yeah, so there's someone I'm thinking about, and she has secondary PTSD and actually PTSD because she's an attorney, and she's had her own traumas in life. So we kind of have a double whammy. And I've been working with her for some time, and I just saw her again last week. And when I was leaving, she had tears in her eyes, and she said, I really have hope. I am going to be okay, and my marriage is going to be okay, and my life's going to be okay. I'm so grateful to you. And I would give more information right now about her situation, but I'm a little concerned if it's too specific that she'll recognize that I was speaking about her on the radio, on this on this blog radio, and I'm careful of that. But I can also say that there was a woman whose husband had leukemia, and she's a trial lawyer. And I worked with her more than 6 times just because her husband had leukemia, and she was extremely stressed. And he's in remission right now, and I see her on occasion, but on the last time I saw her after I taught her the skills and tools, she said to me, I am so grateful I found out about you because I was just going to go take antidepressants and see if I could just move through life that way. But because of these skills, no matter what happens to my husband or no matter what happens to me as a trial lawyer, I know that I'll be able to be my best and help other people. So, Anne, I can't stress enough that I love what I do. And when I hear people tell me how much I've helped them, it just makes me feel, it's hard to even describe it. It just makes me feel like I know that this is why I'm here on the planet, to help other people feel their best.
That's amazing, and it actually comes across in your tone of voice and how passionately you're speaking about these matters. I'm so happy that you were able to join us. Cynthia, please tell our listeners how they can reach you.
Okay, so my cell phone, the business line is 303-968-4565. My website is www.cynthia, Cynthia Lackner, LACKNER.com. And you can always find me at CynthiaLackner.com. So Cynthia at CynthiaLackner.com is a great way to also contact me as well.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And, thank you so much for joining us today. This, just like last week, was a really interesting and vital interview. I'm so happy that you're out there supporting lawyers in the way that you are and ensuring that they are managing their stress so they can have a happier, healthier, more fulfilling life. So thank you for all that you're doing on behalf of lawyers, Cynthia.
It's my pleasure, Anne. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
So listeners, let's keep this conversation going. Join us on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. You can access all of our sites right there on www.esquirecoaching.com. If you're noticing any of these symptoms, let's support one another. Let's talk about it and share some resources and strategies that you might have to help you deal with the stress levels. Next week, we'll be speaking with Dr. Artika Tyner on the lawyer as a leader, how to plant people and grow justice. Until next week, be well.